welcome back to the workshop. This is part 2 of making that crazy feather pattern Damascus Bowie knife, the handle of which is made from a legitimate fossilized mammoth molar tooth, and then the rest of the fittings are gonna be really cool with lots of detail packed in there. So enjoy the video. This is a really epic build, and I could not be happier with how this knife turned out. It is certainly my best Bowie knife to date. Enjoy the video, guys. Consider liking and subscribing. It really helps grow the channel since I'm pretty new to YouTube. Once you see the big reveal at the end, let me know what you think about it in the comments. Let's get to it. So I'm starting off the handle making process by making the plate guard. This is very important to get right. That's why I have those lines scribed on there, as you can see. If I mess up at all and it results in any gapping happening, it will be very noticeable from the top of the knife, and I'll just have to start the guard over again. I start by drilling some pilot holes, and then I move to a carbide end mill to remove the rest of the material and true it up before hammering it on to get our final crispy fit up. The next stop on our knife handle world tour is the silicone bronze spacer. Silicone bronze is one of my favorite materials to work with. It is super nice to machine unless your tooling is dull, in which case it's kind of a nightmare. Not only is it really nice to machine, it also finishes up beautifully and is actually pretty abrasion resistant, so you don't have to worry about it denting or scratching really easily. Despite the relaxing music here, I'm actually pretty terrified. This was a really tricky process, surface grinding this mammoth molar. It's essentially stone separated by layers of mineralization because it is a fossil. It's very expensive and super brittle and does not want to grind quickly, so I just had to go very slowly and carefully. After getting my pieces of mammoth molar flat and straight, it's time to move on to drilling the holes in our frame liners. These two pieces of the frame are made from 416 stainless steel, and these holes will be where the pins go that will hold the scales to the frame itself. Now that the base components of the front half of the handle are done, it's time to move to the back and start making the pommel nut. A pommel nut is simply a female threaded piece of steel that screws onto the tang and really pressurizes that pommel and holds the whole knife together. After drilling and tapping the pommel nut, I move over to the mill. Here, I'm just making sure that it's perfectly round. Ideally, you would do this on a metal lathe, but I don't have a metal lathe, so this is the next best thing. After getting it perfectly round, I actually grind a step into it. This step will actually be what comes in contact with the step in the pommel and pressurizes the entire knife. Alright, so here's the knife. We have the guard and the front bronze spacer fit up, and they're very secure. That fit up is seamless with no gaps. We have the two mammoth scales that have been surface plated, and they are very flat. You can tell something's flat, but if you push it down and try to pick it up, it will actually suction to the piece. So these are very flat. They are sitting at about 0.29 thick. These are about 0.249 thick, and this at its thickest is 0.249 thick. Now this is tapered, which will allow for a little bit of play when I'm installing my pommel nut here into the pommel. I'm gonna have to clear out some room back here so this can fit right there. What we're gonna do next is basically do a mock assembly so we can figure out where our pinholes are going to go in our mammoth. Now drilling pinholes in mammoth is very sketchy because it's a super brittle material. It likes to chip out, and if this chips out, it's gonna be a bad day. So we have our top frame, this goes right here. Bottom frame, which goes right here. They snug up tightly. I've drilled the holes equidistant from the sides and spaced evenly. And then this one, obviously, is just gonna go sit right on top like that. So now all I'm gonna do is CA glue, very small dot of CA glue onto right here and right here on the bottom side of these liners to the mammoth. I'm gonna remove the knife, and then I'm gonna drill the holes in our piece of mammoth molar tooth. Mammoth molar is extremely brittle, which means the drilling process has to go very slow with a very sharp, high-speed drill bit. I've heard that you need a glass cutting drill bit to drill through this stuff, but I found that a really high-speed drill bit with a backing glued to it, as you can see here, works just fine. Okay, so now that we have our scales drilled and rough profiled to about 220 grit to give us that nice double museum fit, we have used drill bits just to align this real quick. I use drill bits because they are perfectly exactly the diameter of the holes, obviously. So now, basically what I have to do is make sure that when I am grinding down this tang here into the rod that is going to be the tang, I make that rod perpendicular to the end of this handle. perfectly so that when I screw this pommel nut into what will be the butt plate or the pommel here, it goes in perfectly at a 90-degree angle and screws on really nicely. So now I'm going to mark our straight line going down the tang here and then our line going across, and then I'm going to take that down to a rod that is the perfect diameter to thread, to use our dies on to get it threaded, and so I can get this thing drilled after all of that is done. And I know that this fits onto the end of this perfectly, exactly how I want it. The reason that I make the pommel nut before I even shape the rod at the end of the tang or make the pommel is because the pommel nut dictates the dimensions of all of those things. Generally speaking, I want about 3/4 of an inch of solid threading on the rod at the end of the tang to grab onto, so I make the end of the tang accordingly with plenty of room to get all the threading that I need. So now I am drilling the 2-step hole in the pommel using the measurements from the pommel nut that I previously made. So folks, here we are. We have the mammoth molar drilled, fitted, completely flat. All the surfaces meet up great. The pommel nut has been fitted as well. It is super tight, no gaps or anything. I've been standing here looking at this behind the LED lights to see if any light comes through anywhere for about 3 hours now, and tweaking the fit up on these meeting surfaces and these meeting surfaces, and it looks fantastic. So finally, it is structurally complete. And now what we can do is we can move on to rough sculpting and shaping the pommel, the spacer, and the guard. Normally I like to start with the guard and move downwards. This time, just because it is a plate guard and the width of the plate guard depends on the width of the spacer, which depends on the width of this, because these scales are going to stay that width. I'm not going to do any contouring. I'm going to start with this spacer right here. Then I'm going to move to the pommel, and finally, the last step is going to be sculpting the guard. Very exciting that I'm at this step. A lot of really careful sculpting and drilling and sanding on this super brittle material, but it looks fantastic so far. And I'm very, very excited to get this thing finished up and get it to start looking and feeling like a knife. The next step is going to be sculpting this spacer right here. This is definitely my favorite part of making a knife, when I get to move from the structural components onto sculpting each individual piece. It's definitely super, super tricky and one of the more difficult parts of knife making, but ultimately this is when the knife really starts to take shape. After making sure that all of the handle components are perfectly flat, even, parallel, and lined up with the knife itself, now I can move on to actually shaping them. The spacer is going to be double fluted, meaning I have to have perfectly flat sides before I do any cutting with the round file. And again, silicone bronze is pretty unforgiving when it comes to dull files. Your files have to be razor sharp to actually make any deep cuts on it. After both of my flutes are even in both depth and width, I move on to some sandpaper and then give it a buff to see if I missed any scratches. This handle component is not going to be mirror finished, but the buffing really helps highlight any scratches from lower grit sandpaper. Now I'm moving on to sculpting and sanding the pommel itself. Before I can put the fluting in the sides, I have to get the top perfectly domed up to 800 grit. Doing a dome flute butt cap like this one is actually pretty tricky and means that you have to pay a lot of attention to the tiny little margins on either side of the flute and make sure they are even and parallel. Here's a good look at what my fittings look like before I go to the grinder. I use a grid system and rely on 90-degree angles and straight lines to make sure that it's even side to side, front to back, and perfectly symmetrical. I cannot stress enough how important measurement is when sculpting fittings. So now that we have the guard, the spacer, the pommel, and the pommel nut to the place we want them, the next step and the last step before we start shaping our mammoth molar tooth is to get all of the really cool file work done on the frame. As you can see, I have scribed out 15 equidistant marks here, as well as a center line and a line on the side right there to show depth, so how deep I want to go with this. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this over to the filing station. I'm going to start putting in those pointed dragon scales going all the way down there, as if they were one on top of another, on top of another, on top of another. I'm most likely going to work from the top downwards. I've never done file work like this before, so I guess we're gonna see how it goes. I'm not really sure. It's a learning curve. Hopefully I don't screw it up too bad. I've left a little bit of extra material on here just in case I do screw it up a little bit, but We shall see how this goes. The trick is going to be keeping those lines crispy because I'm not going to have this be super deep. I think it's going to add a lot, especially when it's sandblasted and blackened. It's going to look really, really nice. This is stainless steel, so I'm not going to have to worry about the black coming off because it's going to be heat blackened instead of patinaed or oxidized with a chemical. So it's just going to be on there permanently, and I'm not going to have to worry about rust or oiling it or anything like that. So let's get to it. If I were to edit this video so that every single part of the build was proportionally as long as it was in real life compared to the other parts, this would be about half the video. This sculpting took a long time, and I had to ice my hands for a long time afterwards. Okay, so here it is, the blade assembled with the liners, the frame tang completely done with the file work. It's all up to 400 grit. Now I have to start working on the rivets for these little holes that I've drilled here. They're teeny tiny little rivets that I have to make, and this is about double the length it should be, so they're going to be really small. So to hold them, I'm using these pliers that I altered, I should say, to have circular jaws, as you can see, so they hold the rivets real nicely. Aside from that, all I have to do is obviously shape these, glue the scales to the frame. Finally, the last thing I'm going to do is shape the pommel nut. That's always the last thing I do because I like to keep this flat head on there for as long as possible, so that every single time I crank it on with the big flat head over there, it compresses it a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more the more times you take it apart, put it back together. And so I want it to be as tight as possible by the time I drill the hole and do the final shaping, so that when I am tightening it with an actual pommel key like this, it's not going to be too difficult or snap the key or bend the key or something like that. So I have the frame CA glued to the scales with no pins in it so that I can go ahead and start shaping it on the grinder. I have scribed the outline of the spacer and the pommel on there, so I'm just going to come within about 30,000ths of an inch from that line and prepare for that museum fit to roll it over. And here we are again with more really calm music and really nerve-wracking stuff happening. Sculpting this mammoth was really stressful and really, really tricky. It's super hard material and kind of destroyed all of my belts and sandpaper pretty quickly. But I honestly don't think I could be any happier with the end result. And here we have all of our steel fittings ready for sandblasting and heat bluing. This will give us that really, really cool matte, dark gray bronze color. Here's a sneak peek at what the frames look like after sandblasting and before heat bluing. I am so happy with how that file work came out. Now it's time to hand sand the massive Bowie knife blade. It's starting at about a 600 grit grinder finish, and I'm going to hand sand it all the way up to 1500 grit pre-etch, and then by the end of the etch, it will be a perfect mirror finish. Here we are going into the ferrochloride etch. It's super important to have really clean steel before this process. In between each cycle of etching, I did about 5 for this knife, I think. I take it out and hand sand it in ascending grits until I get all the way up to 3000 grit. And now is the final step in the entire process, the coffee etch. As you can see, the pattern has been etched onto the blade, but it's really hard to see because there's no contrast. Really concentrated instant coffee brings out those black oxides in the dark layers and gives us that beautiful contrast in the pattern. And to protect the oxides of the dark layers, I apply a hot coat of hard carnauba wax to the outside and then polish it to a beautiful shiny finish. Applying the molten carnauba wax to the blade in such a way that you get even coverage and a mirror finish is extremely difficult and takes a lot of practice. And so after countless hours of work, I can finally do the full assembly on this finished knife and see the final form of the nicest Bowie knife I've ever made. I present to you Phoenix. I am so thrilled with how this knife came out. Everything from that beautiful Damascus pattern, the high polish, high contrast etch, to that super unique plate guard with the brass inlays, the bronze antique spacer, that amazing mammoth molar tooth, the brass pins, and that really cool file work on the frame, the top and the bottom of the frame, continuing into that fluted pommel and the fluted pommel nut. All of these fittings are stainless steel, 416 stainless steel with my matte black gray finish. That's not gonna rust, it's not gonna fade, it can't rub off. And so the entire handle is completely rust proof, and that blade is just a beast of a blade. Very thick with that continued clip on the spine. The really cool super symmetrical plunge grinds with those extra facets on there. Just overall, this is my favorite Bowie knife I have ever made. And the name Phoenix comes from the fact that this pattern is Firestorm multi-bar Turkish twist that has been feathered. And the Phoenix is the bird of fire, right? Feather, Firestorm. Also, I put this really nice aggressive looking feathery file work into the frame. So overall, this thing really just feels like an aggressive knife that wants to cut. It's nice and hefty. The balance point is right where it should be, and I am so thrilled with it. Plus, it is a takedown, so it can easily be disassembled and maintenance can be done on it. I want to know what you guys think of this, so leave it in the comments. Thank you so much for watching this video up to this point. This has been an absolute blast of a build. If you want to see me make more cool stuff just like this, consider subscribing to my YouTube channel and my other social media platforms like Instagram and TikTok, where I post regular updates on what I'm working on. I'm pretty new to YouTube. This is my 4th long form video on YouTube, and I put a lot of effort into filming and editing these. Thank you for coming along with me on this awesome Bowie knife build. So until next time, see ya.